Here at Creative Alliance, it's important for us to promote this area's artists and the city of Baltimore as a creative hub. This is evident through Jim's exhibition. It's truly a special part of Baltimore's history from a very accomplished Baltimore-based artist. I won't take up any more of your time because I know that you came here to hear Jim. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jim Berger.
Thank you, thank you. What young Thomas didn't mention was that he is new here to the Creative Alliance. He's only been here a couple months, and the first thing that happened, they dumped the Jim Berger Photography Retrospective in his lap, and he did a great job with it, so I salute you, sir. I'm to remind people to turn off their cell phones because your snoring will be enough of a distraction. On May 9th, 2016, Gina Caruso and Jeremy Stern of the Baltimore Creative Alliance came to visit me in my home. They had heard about an archiving project I was working on and wanted to see it. I had been scanning and preserving my favorite photographs from 45 plus years of photography, including my years at the Maryland Institute, the Baltimore City Fire Department, the Baltimore City Paper, the Baltimore Sun, and all my years freelancing. Culled from hundreds of thousands of negatives, the archive contained maybe 450 photographs, which represented my life's work. They sat down at my computer and began looking through them. Every photo had a story behind it, and they wanted to hear them all. After about half an hour, Gina turned to Jeremy and said, "Let's give Jim a one-man show." That night at dinner, I told my wife, Sue, all about my day and that I was going to have a one-man show at the Creative Alliance. The next night, I gave her an update on the show and have continued to do that every night since for the past 2.5 years. And I don't want to say another word until I publicly thank my wife, Sue Berger, for being such a good listener. On the wall in the gallery and in the show's catalog, I thank my generous sponsors. I thank them again here and now. But there is one person I must single out because he was instrumental in the show's production. Before I did anything, I wanted to have a scale model of the Creative Alliance Gallery. Who on earth would want something like that? I would. And he figured out how to build one. He helped with the scanning of the final photographs. He did the entire layout of the catalog. He set all the type. The very presentation you are about to see is because of him. There would literally not be a Jim Berger Photography Retrospective without my dear friend, Kevin Lynch. Kevin, here's your chance. Stand up and take a bow. This has been a very successful show. I do a single here. This has been a very successful show, but the success of this show notwithstanding, I am a commercial photographer. People want photos taken, they call me. I take the photos, I give them the photos, they give me money. That's what keeps the lights on. That's what keeps Mrs. Berger in her furs. That's what keeps Junior the cat fed. And I have been blessed with wonderful clients. I work for international corporations, national institutions, universities and colleges. One day I was walking down the hall of one of those colleges and a woman approached me smiling. "You don't know me because we only spoke on the phone, but years ago I called you about my son. He was college age and I was at the end of my rope. He had no direction in life. He was all over the place. He didn't know if he wanted to be an architect. He didn't know if he wanted to be a photographer. He was driving me crazy. So I asked you if you would just talk to him." And I thought about it and I was like, "Oh sure, I remember him." He came over to the house, we sat in my living room and talked. I told him all about my life and my career. I showed him my office, how I kept my books. I had a couple assignments that day and he came with me so he could watch how I work. "Sure, I remember your son. I remember him very well. Good looking boy, bright boy. How's he doing?" And she said, "Oh, wonderful. He's an architect." So obviously, I'm not a very good recruiter for my profession. But it has been very good to me, and I can't imagine doing anything so enjoyable with my life. And that's why I named the show A Charmed Life. Now, I know what you're thinking, because I think this when I come to gallery talks too. What have I gotten myself into? How long is this guy going to go on? I'm going to talk about 13 photographs, and you can keep track. If an hour has gone by and I'm on photo number 3, start heading for that door, and trust me, I'll be right there with you. This is the oldest photo in my archive, the oldest photo in the show. I shot it with my Canon TL, my first really good camera. It was taken in the town where I grew up, Uniontown, Pennsylvania, on New Year's Day, 1973. I would have been 12 years old. January in Western Pennsylvania can be insanely cold, but this New Year's Day was freakishly warm. So warm, in fact, that people were doing things they normally wouldn't be able to do just because they could, like roller skating, for example. These are my sister Bobby's friends, Amy Howard, Renee Nypover, and Lana Lowe. They were skating in the church parking lot near my house. It is certainly of a time, with the striped socks and the saddle shoes and the clip-on skates. 10 years later, I shot this photo at the Shake and Bake Family Fun Center on Pennsylvania Avenue here in Baltimore. I would have been 22 years old. It really illustrates how my style is constantly evolving. This is a valuable lesson for the young photographers in the room. You can't be afraid to try new things. This was when everything changed. I shot this photo while I was at the Maryland Institute in response to an invitation to participate in something called the Fish Show. The art had to be a fish theme, and it was the first time I was ever asked to display a piece in a group exhibit. Just about all the other artists were older and more experienced than I was. It was also the first time that I had to plan and think a shoot completely through. When John Titchener asked me to be in the show, the first thing that popped into my head was a mermaid. And I told that to my friend and schoolmate Bob Baker. It was just an idea that I had. Get a girl to model for me topless, dressed like a mermaid near some water. That was it. Later that day, I was working in the darkroom of the photo department, and this girl showed up. I had seen her around the school, but I didn't know who she was or anything like that. She said that Bob Baker told her I was looking for someone to model topless. Okay. I told her what I had in mind, and she said she would do it. This was in the days before email, obviously, so I asked her name and got her phone number. I told her I'd be in touch. And then she left, and I thought, I think I'm really going to like being a photographer. But then I was committed to doing this thing. I had to scout out a location, something private but accessible. I had to borrow a fisheye lens, rent a mermaid costume. Actually, I didn't rent it. George Goebel, the owner of A.T. Jones Costumers, sized me up as a penniless art student the moment I walked into his shop. He just gave me the thing, and we've been friends ever since. I called her up and we scheduled the shoot. The hardest part was not letting her boyfriend find out about it. Further complicating matters was making sure she was willing to wake up in the middle of the night, because I wanted to pick her up, drive her to the location, and take the photograph at dawn. But it all came together, just as I thought it would. That kind of light, just at sunrise, only lasts for a couple minutes. Looking back, I see this photo as a real dividing line. There was the work I did before and the work I've done since. The signature foodscape nudes that I've made over the subsequent decades can track their lineage to this photo, shot on the shores of Lake Roland, one April morning in 1981. Photography is nothing but moments and the decision of whether or not to shoot them. I shot this at a now shuttered bowling alley in East Baltimore in 1980. For some reason, I was there that day and I had this idea that I wanted to take long exposures of people bowling. Even as I was shooting them, I knew they weren't going to be any good. I had my camera on my tripod, but I couldn't find a place to set up without being in the way, and the light was really bad. And to make matters worse, Helper was there. Helper is every photographer's worst nightmare. He's a photographer too. He's the one who wants to know what speed film you're shooting. He's the one who has shot there before and knows what the proper settings are. I'm in the Dundalk Camera Club. Not many people know this, but the Dundalk Camera Club actually meets in Essex. So with all that working in my favor, I decided to call it quits. As I was leaving, I noticed that boy sitting at the lunch counter. I liked the way he was slumped in the stool. Back then, the style for photographers was to leave your camera on your tripod and carry it over your shoulder. It was a terrible habit to get into, but you just looked so cool doing it. I quietly set the tripod down while looking elsewhere. Then I pulled out my light meter. Remember light meters? And took a reading. I set the aperture and shutter speed and slowly turned the camera in the general direction of the boy. And the whole time I'm praying, please God, don't let Helper say anything. Then, in one quick motion, I leaned over, looked through the viewfinder, focused the camera, and fired the shutter. Boom, got it. That's the kid's father sitting behind him. A second later, he shakes him and says, sit up straight, the man's trying to take your picture. That's how fast these things change. Oh yeah, oh yeah. But I got the shot, or so I thought. I still had to go back to my apartment on Chase Street, hang up black paper on the windows, mix up the chemicals, develop the film, and there it was. But here's the thing, it never fit in anywhere. I never used it. The whole time I was in school, that negative sat in a sleeve in a binder. Okay, forward to the summer of 1982. I had just graduated from the Maryland Institute, and my friend and schoolmate, Barry Holnicker, was working at the Baltimore City paper. He and Jennifer Bishop were the only photographers at the time, and they were overworked. They needed a third photographer, and he thought I'd fit in. He asked me to put together a portfolio, and I jumped at the chance. I went through my negatives, made prints of stuff that I thought the city paper would like, among them this photo, and went to see the art director, a woman named Paula Handler. She was the definition of gruff. She slowly flipped through my prints, and when she was finished, she closed the portfolio, went through them again, and stopped at this one. Without asking my permission, she removed it from the page and pinned it up on a board next to her desk. I'll be keeping this. And that's how I knew I got the job. This is the cover of the catalog and the main image of the show. It was a fire on Fulton Avenue one night in 1981. This was before the show at the City Hall Gallery with my fellow photographer Frank Rehack. This was before the publication of the book In Service with a text by Mike Amft. This was my senior thesis at the Maryland Institute when I photographed and wrote about the Baltimore City Fire Department. When we got here, there was just smoke in the area, and I got up on the fire engine to see what was going on. Then a window caught fire, then another, and finally all three. And it was so quiet. The scene was weird. A lot about the fire department was. In fact, a minute later, I heard this woman on the street yelling and saw a man walking up the middle of Fulton Avenue with his shirt off. He lay down on the pavement, took off his shoes, and pointed toward the heavens. I thought that was worthy of a photo. Practically on cue, a Baltimore City cop straight out of Central Casting showed up, complete with the beat-up shoes and one of those big coats with the brass buttons they all used to wear. It looks like he's doing the get him thing with his thumb. But actually, he's on his radio calling for the paddy wagon. That's what the woman was yelling about. The man was her brother. He lived in the house, and he lit the fire. I went back recently to photograph the house, but like so many things I've shot over the years, it's just not there anymore. People often ask me, what's my favorite photo in the show? Any of these photos came from my archive, a few hundred images that represent my life's work, and they are all my babies. But there is something about this one that holds a special place. Maybe it was because I was fresh out of school and I had just landed a job at the city paper, and I was really starting to fit in. I had made the decision to no longer be the Pittsburgh guy living in Baltimore. Baltimore was going to be home. And there's something so Baltimore about this photo. Old friends sitting in a Naughty Pine bar room drinking beer with the Oriole game playing on the television behind them. I look at this photo and it takes me right back there. I was flat broke that first summer I was out on my own, but my God, it was fun. And if anyone ever asks me where I was on Friday, September 24th, 1982, I'll be able to tell them unequivocally I was at Dimitri's Tavern in Hamden, Baltimore, Maryland, with some very nice people. This is the photo that proves the old photography adage, if you carry your camera around with you long enough, you'll eventually come upon a cop giving a nude man directions. So I was driving to work at the Baltimore Sun one morning, cruising down St. Paul Street, and I had my cameras in the seat next to me. And I passed the usual stuff. Woman standing on bus stop, mother crossing street with child, naked man walking down sidewalk. And I think, yeah, that's unusual. So I turned onto Chase Street and I got out of the car. Something was bound to happen. Sure enough, seconds later, here comes Baltimore's finest. The cop's name was Smitty. I knew him. Obviously, he wasn't giving him directions. I just happened to shoot as he was waving his hand to another officer and yelling at him that the man's clothes were in a pile on the next corner. Just another typical commute. I got back in my car and drove to work. I wasn't even late. Here's how it works at the Baltimore Sun. When someone is interviewed for a story, the reporter gets the person's name and a phone number. Those people are potential subjects for photographs to illustrate the article. In the fall of 1998, the Sun was doing a spread on breast cancer, and I was handed a sheet of paper with the names and phone numbers of 3 women. This was Sue Reedy, and she was the only one to call me back. To be honest, all they wanted was a portrait. I could have knocked it out that afternoon. But as luck would have it, she was only available on the weekend and told me I could photograph her at her home in Carroll County. She was having a cookout with her family. I didn't shoot this photo that day. I shot photos like this. Afterward, I sat in her backyard and she told me her story. It was heart-wrenching. A year before, she had been taking care of her mother, who was losing her own battle with breast cancer. That's when Sue found out she had the disease too. Without hesitation, she decided to forego lumpectomy surgery and the accompanying 6 weeks of radiation treatment. She would have a double mastectomy and continue caring for her mother. It was just easier that way. Her mother later died, and Sue decided she wanted to have her breasts rebuilt. I entered the story after that complicated process had begun. But the gist of the story was she was going to go through those steps. She was going to celebrate her mother by running in the Susan G. Komen Race for the Cure, and then go visit her mother's grave. So I took my photos back to the Sun and told the editors there was more to the story. And if they wanted me to go after it, and if there was room, I would. I got the go-ahead and was told to keep my eye on the deadline. So I talked to Sue, and she cautiously agreed. I asked if I could go with her to see her doctor. She said she'd think about it, and eventually said yes. I wanted to show what the procedure was like, including her scars, but keeping in mind that the photos would have to run in a family newspaper. We eventually came up with this solution. I shot her practicing for the race, and then I was up against the deadline. We ended her story here. When the piece ran, everyone was thrilled, and I told Sue I would come and cheer her on at the race the next week. But the night before the race, she called me in tears. She was back in the hospital. That incision on her back never really healed properly, and now she had a staph infection. There would be no race. No visit to her mother's grave, and her next surgery was postponed. That's the way these things go in the newspaper business. You just run out of time. But I really ran out of time. This was right as I was leaving the Sun and going out on my own as a freelancer. It was a flurry of activity those first weeks setting up my business. But then I started thinking about Sue and wondering how she was doing. I got back in touch. She didn't even remember calling me the night before the race. A staph infection will do that. But it was cleared up, and her next surgery was scheduled. I realized my time was my own now, and I asked if I could keep shooting. For years, I had shown up on someone's doorstep, shot the assignment, and left. Now I could do what I wanted, and I wanted to see this one through to the end. I stayed with her through the following year. I was with her through surgeries and doctor's visits. I watched her run in the race for the cure, and Sue even asked me to come with her to visit her mother's grave. You can't just drop in on people and take photos like this. There's no substitute for time and trust. And at that point, I had both. And I asked Sue for one more favor. I wanted to shop her story around. As it turned out, nothing could have been easier. I, some would say naively, took a bus to New York City carrying all my photos, notes, and a list of the biggest women's magazines. Women's Day was the biggest, so I started there. No appointment, I just walked in. They bought them on the spot. When the story ran, it was groundbreaking, and for months following, Sue received cards and letters from well-wishers. We got to be close friends. After an experience like that, it's practically impossible not to. And Sue Reedy has been cancer-free for 21 years. Any list of the worst movies of all time include director Ed Wood's 1959 classic, Plan 9 from Outer Space. And more often than not, it holds the #1 position. The movie was so bad, in fact, that a movie about the making of the movie came out in 1994 titled Ed Wood. This is Conrad Brooks. He appeared in both movies. I remember watching Plan 9 as a kid. It was a real stink bomb, and it had it all. Bad acting, bad dialogue, cardboard tombstones, paper flying saucers. I loved it. So when the movie Ed Wood came out, it was a big hit, and we were talking about it at the Baltimore Sun's choir practice. This is the Baltimore Sun Choir. That's Jerry Smolinski on the left. He was the former spokesman for the paper. Jerry said that his uncle, Conrad Brooks, was in Plan 9. Naturally, I didn't believe him because I never believed anything Jerry said, but he swore it was true. His uncle was Conrad Bajitsky, and he changed it to Brooks when he went to Hollywood in the 1950s. Then I started to think maybe he was telling the truth. I knew an Eddie Bajitsky who worked in the Sun's engraving department. I never actually saw him engrave anything. I only saw him take bets. He ran a profitable bookmaking business out of the department for his half-century with the newspaper. He was Conrad's brother. Of course, I was fascinated and wanted to meet a touchstone from my childhood. No problem, said Jerry. You write him a fan letter, and I'll give it to him as soon as I can find him. And so began Jerry's protracted quest to locate Uncle Conrad. Years passed without a solid lead as to Conrad's whereabouts. Rumors persisted he was still in California making movies. For my part, I continued to write, rewrite, and update my letter of introduction to Conrad and dutifully give it to Jerry every time he left town for a family function where the two might meet. And with each undelivered letter, my obsession grew. The low ebb came in the summer of 1999 when I made my way to the Kajarowski Funeral Home to attend services for Conrad's sister, Angela. He didn't show, and I wept openly. Were you and Angela close? Asked another mourner. No. I had all but given up when one night around midnight the phone rang. Hey pal, this is Conrad Brooks. I hear you've been looking for me. At that point, the adventure was just beginning. I went to meet him. He was living in a trailer in West Virginia. I even chronicled my search, and the Washington Post magazine ran the story Plan B for Plan 9 in December of 2003. Brooks was a real character, and we became good friends. He was always signing pictures and posters for me and selling me VHS tapes of the movies he was in, each one worse than the last. Followed closely by, make it $100 for everything. A couple times a year I would pick him up and we would drive over to the horse races at Charlestown. He would borrow money to bet and pay me back from the winnings. And if he lost, well, that's just how these things go. He knew about the retrospective and was very excited to come, but he died last December, and my world has gotten a little less interesting. Rest in peace, Conrad Brooks. Iris out, fade to black. This is a photo I chased for years. I love Mount Vernon. I drove through it the day I first arrived in Baltimore. I lived there when I was in college. I saw it in all types of weather, and it was just so beautiful in the snow. But every time I tried to photograph it, something was wrong. It had been shoveled, or there were too many people around, or there were footprints all through the snow. It was just never right, and I tried a lot. So one day in 2005, it was snowing, and I thought, I'm going to try it again. I was living in Alonzoville back then. I always remember it as a Sunday because my wife, Ann, was at home, not at work. She was sitting in our sunroom in a big comfy chair doing a crossword puzzle. The cat was curled up on her lap. I think it was a Sunday, but it could have been another day, and she took the day off from work because the snowstorm had been predicted. So that may have been the case. Anyway, I grabbed my camera, told her I was going out, and drove to Mount Vernon. When I got there, I looked around and I was like, oh, come on. Much of the pavement was just wet. The snow was melting as it landed. So I stood there waiting and waiting. And finally it stopped snowing and turned to rain. That was that. I walked back to my car, drove home soaking wet, and there was Ann and the cat right where I left them in the sunroom. So I sat down in the other chair, and she's doing her crossword puzzle. So I go, And finally, she looks up and says, what? And I go, I always wanted to take a photo of Mount Vernon in a snowstorm, and every time I tried to do it, something wasn't right, and I went down there today, and there's not enough snow. And she looked at me, and she looked out the window, and she looked back at me and said, well, it's snowing now. Go back down there and take the picture. And then she added the worst thing you can ever say to a man. She said, you big baby. And with that, I stood up, walked out of the room, picked up my camera, and walked to my car. I didn't even put on dry clothes. I put my camera in the car, and I'm cleaning the snow off the windshield, and the whole time I'm talking to myself, big baby. I'm not a big baby. Who you calling a big baby? So I'm driving down there, and Ann was right about one thing. It was snowing. And you know how, like in Baltimore, when it snows, civilization breaks down immediately? Well, I get to the intersection of Maryland and North Avenues, and no one is obeying the traffic lights. Cars are just coming from everywhere. And I'm trying to pick my way through all that without getting killed. And I'm going, who's a big baby? You're the big baby. Finally, I slide into Mount Vernon. There really wasn't any place to park, so I sort of just shoved my car onto a snowdrift in front of the Hackerman house and walked through the snow to the park. And it was like, cue the choir of angels. Ah! It was beautiful. Everything was covered in snow and not a footprint. It was as though no one had been there. And as you can see, Charles Street is completely overwhelmed. The snowplow hadn't even come through. I took the picture. Ann could not be here tonight, but Ann, wherever you are, darling, thank you for the push. I was back in Uniontown, PA at the end of July 1999. My father was under hospice care by then. We had set up a hospital bed in our living room. That made it easier on everyone except my mother, who had taken to spending nights on the sofa rather than upstairs in their bed. She wanted to be there any time he woke up in case he might need something. Most of the time she just looked exhausted. We were tucking him in for the evening, and as he dozed off, my mother started to sing to him in German. It was a love song from the opera Hansel and Gretel. Now, it was hardly a secret. In a family filled with bad singing voices, Lisa Berger had the worst. I was lying on the couch with my camera, and when I thought my father had had enough, I said, "Pop, pretend you're asleep and she'll stop singing." He started to laugh, she started to laugh, and I took this photo. He was still asleep when I left for Baltimore the next morning. My wife and I spent the weekend at the beach, visiting with some friends, and then we came back to Baltimore. I was packing to return to Uniontown, and when the phone rang, even before I answered it, I knew it was my mother telling me that my father had died. So that was it. This was the last photo I ever shot of him. I never saw him again. I don't know if one picture can sum up the relationship between two people, but sometimes I look at this one and wonder. This is Megan Hildebrandt. She's a performance artist and was at one time an artist in residence right here at the Creative Alliance. She was originally from Detroit and had an out-of-towner's appreciation for Baltimore's marble step scrubbing tradition. She was greatly influenced by this photo by A. Aubrey Bodine, shot in the mid-1940s. If the steps weren't Baltimore's trademark before that shot, they certainly were afterward. He titled it Wash Day. The man practically invented Maryland, and much of our amber-laden views of nostalgic past came from his lens. In 2005, Baltimore Magazine asked me to write an art feature about him. I went down to Caroline County to look at some original prints and talk with his daughter, Jennifer Bodine. She was the custodian of his work and legacy and had just published an enormous picture book, Bodine's Chesapeake Bay Country. Wash Day was one of the photos in the book. Most people who see it are certain the scene is here in Highlandtown. I did. Jennifer had never been there. She told me she found the word Penrose written on the back of one of her father's photographs. I promised to try and find it. There is a Penrose Avenue in the city. It's not here, it's in West Baltimore, in a tattered neighborhood in the shadow of Bon Secours Hospital. Getting there wasn't easy. Blocked streets, one-way and do not enter signs effectively cut off the community. I finally parked and walked in, a copy of the book tucked under my arm. I wandered up and down the street. It was pretty much deserted. Eventually, I met Abigail Winstead, standing in her doorway. She was 18 at the time and had never heard of Bodine. I showed her Wash Day. She studied the photo for a minute and kept looking around, comparing the past with the present. And then suddenly, "That's Miss Ruth." She snatched the book from my hands, dashed across the street, and disappeared into a house. A minute later, she runs back across the street with another girl and into another house. When they returned, they brought another woman with them. She was older, but too young to be anyone in the picture. She introduced herself as Margaret Wade and opened the book. "That's Miss Ruth, all right," pointing to the lady in a flowered dress. But before I could ask to meet her, she said, "She died 3 years ago." She told me that Miss Ruth was Ruth Crawford Martin, but her husband, Frank Martin, was still alive. I take care of Mr. Frank. So we went to meet him. I showed him the photo. The room was too dark and he couldn't really see it, so we helped him outside. And when he looked at the photo, he just beamed. Beneath the decay of Penrose Avenue, it is still possible to detect its beauty and charm. Frank Martin died a few months later, and I was glad that I looked for this place. Starting in 1978, the map of my life was a straight line 200 miles long. It ran the stretch of US Route 40 between Uniontown, Pennsylvania to the west and Baltimore, Maryland to the east. I must have passed the Grandview Tavern 100 times over the years while traveling between my home in Maryland and my parents' house in Pennsylvania. It was the sort of place I always meant to stop at, but never did until 1989. It wasn't so much a tavern, although it did have beer. It was more of a not very well-stocked general store stuck out in the middle of nowhere. The interior was dusty and worn out. The owner was a friendly old-timer, and if I knew his name, I've forgotten it, which makes me think I never knew it. It was a real throwback. He lived in a cabin on the property, and there was even an outhouse. Before I left, I photographed the old man sitting on the steps. He told me to stop back anytime. After that, I settled into my routine of always meaning to stop, but never stopping. A few years later, I noticed it was closed up. I imagine it got to be too much for the old guy, or he died, or something like that. Over time, the building was vandalized. People dumped garbage in front of it, and eventually it even burned. I moved my mother to Baltimore in 2004 following her stroke, then returned to Uniontown to sell her house and get rid of the contents. It took about a week to finish the job. There was a snowstorm the day I left, but I stopped at the Grandview to take one more photo and one last look around. Then I headed east. Everything behind me was gone. This is one of the national Bohemian Foodscape nudes. They were really popular. The kids especially like them. But there's like 10 in the set, and some people have collected all of them, so I can't complain. This one was in trouble from the beginning. Basically, I knew what I wanted to do. This image was what I envisioned from the start, but logistically, it was a nightmare. I was divorced in 2010, and I moved from my house in Alonzoville to one in Remington. The Alonzoville house had many options to shoot something like this. Remington, not so much. But I had a model lined up, and I was determined to get it shot. The location was just a problem that had to be solved. I looked around, nothing was right. And then the answer turned out to be right in my own backyard. Actually, through my backyard and across the alley. One man owned all the garages on my block and rented them out. Problem solved. I saw one was available, looked inside when the workmen were cleaning it out, and thought it would be perfect. I could create a scene and spray all the beer I wanted. It was a garage. So I went to the garage rental man. I'd like to rent garage number 23 for a month. You can't rent it for a month, you have to rent it for 2 months. But I only need it for a day. You have to rent it for 2 months because I need a month's notice if you're moving out. You see where I'm going with this? There was a lot of that. In the end, I signed a 2-month lease. The ink on that contract wasn't dry when my model backed out. That never happens to me. But it sure happened this time. So I really had to scramble. I contacted a woman who had expressed interest in modeling and tried to nudge her into doing this shoot. She wasn't in the area, but at least she was up for it. I'm going to be away for work for a while. We can't do it until I get back. How long will that be? I asked, already knowing the answer. Not long, 2 months. So for 2 months, every time I walked out my back door, I saw that empty garage staring back at me, mocking me. The thought of another 2-month rental really galled me. So I let it go. I decided to shoot in a motel room instead. I had shot in motel rooms before. I really like them. They always have that strange furniture coupled with odd color combinations, plus bathrooms and parking, and a kind of understood discretion that we national bohemian nude photographers demand. So we were all set. We had a date, a time, and a place to meet. I bought a case of beer. After everything that had gone wrong, it was comforting in the certainty of knowing what happens when you open a shaken bottle of beer. The day before the shoot, I was so excited. I just couldn't help myself. I had to see one erupt. I took a bottle outside, shook it up, opened it, and oh, I know. I didn't shake it enough. I got another one. Really shook it a lot. And oh, wait, I know. This is warm. I got a cold one from the refrigerator. Maybe bottles don't work. I bet it has to be a can. I ran out and bought a 6-pack. These are cold. Maybe I should try warm. Are you wondering why I didn't buy both when I was out? I sure am. Well, it didn't make a difference anyway. So there I am, standing in my backyard, surrounded by open, practically full bottles and cans of beer. And I just know my neighbors are looking through their curtains and saying, what in the hell is going on out there? The shoot is tomorrow, and I got nothing. And then I remember something from high school science. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't remember anything from high school science. I got a hammer and a nail, poked a small hole in the top of a can, and Jim Berger Photography was back in business. Smooth sailing from here on in, baby. The next day, I got to the motel and set up the room. When the model arrived, I showed her what we were doing. We took a couple test shots, made some adjustments. Hold the 6-pack closer to your body. Hold the can straight out in front of your face. Now we were ready to get started. We had plenty of beer. We'd shoot until we got it, right? Wrong. Just from those few shots, there was beer everywhere. Soaking into the carpet, soaking into the bed, soaking into the pillows. The pillows. I stripped the bed, threw down towels. Okay, regroup. Right as I'm about to shoot, something lands on my head. Yep, beer. Dripping off the ceiling. More towels. The last of the towels. Okay, concentrate. We've got to get this quick. And we did. I figured it would take 50. We did it in 10. We cleaned the room as best we could. It smelled like a bar. As I closed the door, I remember thinking, there's no way I'm getting away with this. But I did. I never heard a word. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. We backed our cars out of there and fled. And as I drove back to Baltimore, I named the piece, Foam at Last. Thank you. If there are no questions, thank you and good night. No.
I noticed a picture of the photographer at the track.
Yes.
The back wall.
Yeah.
It pops more than a lot of your portraits. Is something different on that one? Is it closer? Is it just brighter?
Well, I was in the presence of greatness. That's the one job I always wanted that I never got. So that was probably why that was. He was a great guy. I forget it. I have his name written down, but he's so great I don't remember his name. Anybody else? Yes, Connie.
Do you have a favorite shot?
Let me go back, and I'll read. I'll read what I said. I'll read what when I answered that.
I know what you said.
Yeah. Do I have a favorite shot? Oh, jeez, I should have been ready for this. I really do like the one of my parents. You know, it sounds kind of hokey, but I really do. That was one I'm really glad that I shot. Yeah, Susan.
What is the foodscape thing?
Oh, yeah. Foodscape is a spoof of Artscape. It's an annual show. The very first Artscape, the city really messed it up. They said that it was going to be this big celebration of the arts, and then all they did was just another typical city celebration, neighborhood celebration. And there was fried dough and chicken and sandwiches and all this stuff. And then the art was kind of just shoved off into one corner. So there was this group of, kind of snarky artists that started a show the next year called Foodscape, and it was just going to be food-themed art. And that's what that was. And even after the city got their shit together and started really doing it right, we just kept doing it, and we've been doing it now for like 35 years or something. It's been a long time, and many of us have been in Artscape. That nude of Ronald McDonald was in Artscape, and still we're just biting the hand that feeds us. Yeah, but that's what that was. Yes.
So I read an article that said you don't like to take pictures of people with tattoos because it detracts from the photograph, and then it mentioned also maybe there was some religious sensibilities associated
Oh,
with that.
yeah. I hid behind that. That's bullshit. But the but it's like a real easy way. It's an easy way to get out of. Oh well, I'm Jewish, and and as far as the tattoos go, I've photographed women with tattoos, but I work around it. But if you photograph a tattoo, it's like the first thing you go to, the first thing or it's like having a sign in the background, or if somebody is just wearing a T-shirt with something written on it. Even before you look at what's going on in the photo, you read what the message is, and that's why it's just not my first choice.
So you don't have religious sensibilities about the things.
We're still. I thought I made that pretty clear. No, there's nothing. That was in that interview. Tony Hayes interviewed me for the exam, Baltimore Examiner, Post Examiner. Thank you. It was the Post Examiner. The copy editor got me, and I, he was just interviewing me, and I'm saying all sorts of nonsense, and he's writing it all down, and then I read it, and I'm like, oh, jeez. Yeah. Somebody get me out of this. Yes.
Jen, you eloquently told us the story about the nude and the beer, but have there been a time where it wasn't about an item like beer, but the actual person that was difficult?
No, there was never anything. No.
You would like to share
No. They all worked out fine. I can tell. I'll tell you, the one in the cornfield. There's two in the cornfield, but there's one in the cornfield where all my models are amateurs. I don't really hire a model, and it usually starts out with someone asking me, "Hey, where do you get your models?" They're just sort of curious, and I go, "Well, just like this." And so I met this one woman, and I said, "Can you do a handstand, or could you do a headstand?" And she said, "Yes." And then I reeled her in. I said, "Can you do a headstand nude?" Well, she couldn't back down, so she said, "Yeah." And then I went, hit the home run and said, "Can you do a headstand nude in a cornfield?" And she said, "Sure." So, and I thought, let's go. So we went up to at the Jewish Center up in Owings Mills, and we got down at the end of the parking lot. There was a cornfield. And it looks like we're in the middle of Iowa, I know, but we're really right. We're really right there. And then we're like 2 rows of corn. Then there was this tiny little clearing, and then all this corn. So I said, "Okay, take off your clothes. Go ahead." And I shot like 3 photos, and I hear a little commotion behind me. I turn and I look through the corn, and daycare had let out from the Jewish Center, and all these kids are running around. I'm like, oh shit! So we just grabbed everything and ran into the corn, and I thought, well, then by that time she was sort of done, and I said, well, we're going to go with what we got, and that was the shot. And that wasn't really difficult, but wasn't the ideal shoot either, but that worked out fine.
Where was your mind going? Nude, handstand, cornfield.
Yeah.
Can you,
Where was I going? That was the end point, I think. I don't know that I could have gone any further with it.
I'm just wondering how you
Yeah.
got there.
Yeah, I know, that's true. I mean, well, because all the models are anonymous, it's like, how can I keep her anonymous if she's doing a headstand, right? So I just had her legs up in the air. Yeah, that was it. It's not that complex, Susan. You're really trying to read an awful lot into this stuff. Yeah. Thank you. Vic Ramita, ladies and gentlemen. Yes.
Yeah, just to shift gears from nude ladies with National Bohemian real quick. I'm just wondering if, like looking through the exhibition, maybe it's because I'm a younger guy, like I feel like there's a sense of nostalgia in a lot of the photographs, and I'm wondering if that's something that you think about when you're shooting, or if it's something that just naturally happens with 20 or 30 years of distance.
I know. No, I know what you mean. But there's a lot of things that I do photograph because I have a feeling they're going to be gone. And I do like, shooting that kind of stuff because and things change. There are a lot of people in the show. Like, I know that I told these stories and you're like, oh Jesus, this person died and that person died. But people die. And whenever I envision this retrospective, it never even crossed my mind that Don Hoffman wouldn't be here, or Mike Bowler. Those are two people that I worked with at the Sun. But they both passed away recently. There were guys that were whenever I started at the Sun in '88, I thought I was a pretty young guy, but there were guys my age now that they were that age whenever I got there, and I'm like, they're the ones that are dying off. Not that we're all going to drop dead. I mean, no one's going to get away. But yeah, and so I get nostalgic for people too. Don't be nervous if I photograph you, but I mean, I can say, yeah. Recently I went to see Gil Sandler, and I photographed him, and he's like, oh shit, Jim Berger's here. But he's fine. He's fine. Everything's okay. Yeah. Yes.
I noticed out front there was a lot of pictures of firefighters.
Yeah.
And it's amazing, you really bring out the humanity of the firefighters. And was that your intent when you were doing those shots?
Yeah, well, that was my thesis when I was at the Maryland Institute. So I was there a lot. I didn't just drop in and take some photos. I was there for a solid year shooting them. And then after I put up my thesis, I kept shooting with Frank Rehack, and we did a show at City Hall Gallery. And then after that, there was a book. So I was around these guys a lot, and we got to be very close. And it's not just like fires all the time. In fact, even the book, there's not a lot of fire. It's all the other stuff. And you spend a lot of time with them. It's pretty intense. Thank you. Thanks. Yes.
Hey Jim, do you ever not have your camera with you and you pass by something and you just kick yourself?
Yeah, every once in a while, but I'm not. But I'm really not one of those guys that carries my camera all the time. There's one photo of an old Impala in a auto showroom, and the guy that owned that building collected old cars, and he would park that Impala in there and light it up. And every time I drove by, it was never right. There was a couple cars parked outside, and then sometimes there wouldn't be any cars, and the car would be in the showroom, but the guy didn't turn on the lights that night or whatever. And that was one that I always kind of wanted to take. And one night I drove by there, and everything lined up, and I was drunk out of my mind. I don't even remember where I was coming from. And I had to go home and grab my camera and come back, and I swear to God, it was 1 degree, and I'm stumbling around out there. But that was a shot that I did want to get, and I got it. So, but then, yeah, every now and then something gets away, and I, kind of missed it. But I live without it. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Kelly.
You ever take any pictures that you're happy with your phone?
No. I am. I take a lot of, I do use my phone to take notes and stuff like that, but quite the opposite. If I ever do take something with my phone, I'd be like, man, I wish I had my camera. And then we come back to Dan's question. Incidentally, everyone should take a page from Dan Larson's playbook, because he bought a photo of the Mount Vernon in the snow. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
So what's next? What are you working on?
Yeah. Not another retrospective. I'll tell you that this thing broke me. I've fantasized about doing a book. You know, I don't want to say I thought about writing a book, but I fantasized about it. And I have these photos, and I have the stories, and I have other stories that aren't in the show. And if I could maybe weave a narrative through all of that, that would probably be something that I might like to do. But it would kind of have to be the same thing. It wouldn't be published by Simon and Schuster. You know, I'd have to do it all myself, and I'd have to promote it the way I promoted this show, by Facebook and writing emails to people. And it wouldn't be, when the book would come out, I know it wouldn't be cheap, because it would have to be done. It wouldn't be some paperback. It'd be something with some oomph to it. So, would you buy one? Sue, get her credit card. Get her credit card number. We won't run it until the book is published. Any questions? Anything? Anyone over here? Nothing? Are we done? Oh, okay. Yeah.
So just on your inspiration, so you showed the roller skating picture, Warm Day in January, but just how you got to the point, or what more inspired you to get into this career?
Yeah. You're Uniontown, right? Yeah. Go Red Raiders. Oh, Mustangs. Boo. I was the best artist at Uniontown High School. And yeah, right. I was the best artist at Uniontown High School. The other guy came in second. So, but I came to the Maryland Institute. I got really lucky. I had good parents. They wanted me to go to Pitt or Penn State or WVU and major in art. And then late in the game, I discovered art schools, and they fell for it. I mean, I dropped the bomb on them and said I'd like to go to art school rather than major in art at WVU, where I would major in drinking. And they let me go. But I came here on the strength of my drawing portfolio. I wanted to be an illustrator. And then I got into the Maryland Institute with a building full of the best artists in their high schools, and man, did I suck. And I was better at photography, and then I just started going down that road. There's a photo of my mentor, a guy named Richard Kirstel, and he walked me, into a great career. And that's just, everything just kind of went from there. Worked at the city paper, worked at the Baltimore Sun, and now I'm freelance. So now it's just gone very well. That's the whole career track. Thank you very much. This has been really fun.